Hello, welcome. Let's do a small project. Let's do a small project with Python. Let's build a finance tracker. So let's build a finance tracker that we can use to track our expenses. So we want to create a tracker, and this tracker should allow us to add transactions. We should also be able to get transactions from this tracker if we want to view transactions. And we should also be able to see how much we've spent. So that's a simple tracker that we're going to build. So we are going to use a class. So we'll build a class, and inside of this class, we're going to add methods. So we're going to use these methods to add transactions, get transactions, and see how much money we have spent. We are also going to use the Pandas data frame. So all our transactions will be saved in a Pandas data frame. So this project will give us a chance to interact with the Pandas data frame. So let's get started. So the first thing that we want to do is import Pandas. So we're going to import Pandas as PD. Now, let's give our tracker a title. So we'll insert a cell above here and give our tracker a title. We'll just call this finance tracker. Okay. And markdown, run, and we get our title. Now, let's create a class, and we're going to call this class finance tracker. Just like that. Now, the first thing that we want to do is to create an empty data frame. So this data frame will only have columns. Okay, so the columns will represent the information that we want to have in our tracker. So for example, if we spend some money on some groceries and we want to record this information in our tracker, we need to record the date of the transaction. Okay. We also want to categorize this transaction. So for example, if we spend some money on some sugar and bread, that will be categorized as groceries. If we spend some money on some, let's say, books and pencils, that will be categorized as stationery. So we're going to have a category column, and then we have description. Description will basically describe what we've spent money on. And then we also have the amount of money that we have spent on that transaction. So we're going to first create an empty data frame with nothing but columns. So we're going to create this data frame inside of this init method. So let's define an init method here. Okay. And inside of this method, that's where we are going to create our empty data frame with nothing but columns. Okay. So let's call this data frame transactions. And this data frame, we're going to use the Pandas data frame constructor. And then we are going to add columns to the columns parameter. Okay. So what we want is, we want the date of the transaction. Okay. And then we want the category. We also want the description, and we want the amount of money that we have spent on that transaction. Okay, so this will be an empty data frame with nothing but columns. We don't have no rows on this data frame. Now, let's define a method. Okay, so the method that we're going to define is a method that we're going to use to add transactions to this data frame. So let's create a method here called add transactions. Okay. So this add transactions method will be used to add transactions to our tracker. So what information do we need to add to our tracker? So we need date. Okay. We need to pass the date, the category, description, and we want the amount, just like that. Okay. Now, what we're going to do is that we're going to save this information that we're going to add in a dictionary. So let's create a new variable here. Let's call this new transactions. So we're going to save this information that we're going to add in a dictionary. So the first thing that we're going to get will be the date, and the date will be the key, and the value will be the date. And then we'll get the category. So the category is supposed to be the key. So category, and the value will be category. And then we will have description, and the value will be description. Okay, then we are going to have obviously the amount. Okay, so when we start adding information to this tracker, we'll be required to pass the date, the category, and the description, and the amount. So this is the information that will be required to be passed into our tracker. Now, what we want to do is we want to collect this information. And once we collect this information, we want to add this information to this empty data frame that we have created here. So the first thing that we want to do is convert this dictionary here that we are going to create from the information that we're going to receive into a Pandas data frame. So this will become a Pandas data frame. And then we're going to use the concat function to concatenate this new data frame to the data frame that we have initialized here. So to create a data frame here, we need to pass this to the Pandas data frame constructor. Okay, just like that. So we're passing this dictionary to the Pandas data frame constructor. This will create a Pandas data frame. So now we're going to concatenate this data frame to this data frame that we have initialized here with only columns. So we're going to use the Pandas concat function. So we'll say, let's create a variable here called transactions. Okay, transactions will be PD Pandas, and then we use the concat function. So we're going to use the Pandas concat function, and then inside of this function we'll pass the two data frames. Okay, so the first data frame will be this data frame, the first data frame that we created here, this empty data frame. Okay, the data frame with nothing but columns. Okay, so that will be the first data frame, and then we'll concatenate this data frame to the new data frame. This is the data frame that will have the information that we're going to add to the tracker. So this is the new data frame, just like that. Okay, so this is how we are going to add information to our tracker. So now let's try to add some information to our tracker. So the first thing that we need to do is to create an object of this class. So we will create an object called, let's just call this object. Okay, this will be the object of the finance tracker. And now we're going to use this object to add transactions to our tracker. So we'll say object, and then we'll call the add transactions method. So now inside of this method, we're required to pass the date. Okay, you can see like the first parameter here is the date. So we're required to pass the date, the category, the description, and the amount. So let's pass the date. Let's say this transaction is, the year is 2024. The date is 02 Feb. And transaction is on the second day of Feb. It's the second day of February. And let's say we are spending some money on stationery. Okay. and then we are buying, the description will be buying books, and let's say the transaction is $10. Okay, so if we run this code here, what do we get? Let's see if this transaction has been added to our tracker, but we get an error here. What is this error? If using all scalar values, you must pass an index. So what we're going to do here, to this new transactions data frame that we are adding information to, since we are passing scalar values, let's add an index. Okay, so let's add an index, and this index, let's just give it a value of 0, like that. Let's run this code again. Okay, so we don't get an error. So this means that this information has been added to our data frame. So now what we want to do is to view the information that we've added to the data frame. So we're going to define another method here. So this method will be the get transactions method. So we're going to use this method to get transactions, to view transactions that we have saved in our data frame. So let's do this. We want this to return the transactions data frame, like that. So now when we call this get transactions method on this object that we've created, get transactions, we should be able to see this information that we've added to the tracker here. So let's run this code, and there you have it. So this is the first information that we've added to the tracker. The date is 2024, 2nd February. The category is stationery, buying some books, and the amount that we spent is $10. So this looks like it's working just fine. Now, let's add some control to our add transactions method. So what we want to be able to do is, first, we want to check. We should be able to check that this amount that has been added here is either a floating data type or an integer data type. So if the information, if the amount is integer data type or floating data type, then we should add this information to our data frame. If it is not, we want to return some message, something like invalid amount, transaction failed. Let's create a conditional statement here. Okay, if we're going to use the is instance function. So the is instance function will be used to check if the amount here, the amount passed, is of integer data type, either integer data type or float data type. Okay, so we'll check if this amount here, so the first parameter that we're going to pass here is the amount, since we're checking the amount. And then we are checking if this amount is of integer data type or float data type. If it is, then we want this transaction to go ahead. So let's add indentation here, and we can push this. Okay, and this one as well must be inside the block. So now what will happen is that if somebody inputs the amount which is not of integer data type or float data type, then this transaction will fail. It won't be added to our data frame. So if this amount is not of integer data type or float data type, we want our method to return invalid amount, transaction failed, or let's say transaction note added, just like that. Okay, but if the transaction is successful, we want to return transaction added successfully, something like that. Okay, so now let's try to add another transaction to our tracker. So we're going to call the add transactions method, and then we are going to pass what are we going to pass here? The date, the first parameter is the date, so the first argument should be the date. So 2024 02, let's say, or on 03, and what are we buying here? Let's say we bought some groceries. Okay, so the category here will be groceries. Let's use a small g, groceries. And what did we buy? Let's say we bought sugar and we paid $2. Okay, so now if we run this code, what we get, so you can see that groceries has been added here, okay, to our data frame. So let's see what happens if we change this value here. Okay, the $2, instead of a $2 integer, let's make it a string. Let's see if this transaction is going to go through. So if we run this code, you can see that the transaction doesn't go through here. Okay, this is because the amount here is a string, and what we want is we want the amount to be of integer data type or float data type only. So if the amount is a string, that transaction should fail. As a matter of fact, if we call this add transactions method here, okay, we should be able to see invalid amount message. So if we call this add transactions method and we run this code, what we get, okay, no, we're not supposed to call it. We're supposed to add values. Let's just call it here. Let's run this code again. So you can see that we get this invalid amount transaction not added. This is because the 2 here is a string, not an integer or a float. But if we change this to an integer and we run this code, so we get transaction added successfully. So this part of our code is working just fine. So we are going to use the add transactions method to add transactions to our tracker. Now let's get to get transactions. So the get transactions method right now is returning, if we call this method object get transactions, run this code, so we get the transactions that we've added to our tracker. But the problem is that the index doesn't change. So the first value is added at index 0, and then the second value is added at index 0 as well. So the index doesn't change. So it seems like this data frame here is using this index that we have in the new transactions data frame. So what we need to do is to tell this concat to ignore the index. Okay, so we're going to use the ignore index parameter and pass it a value of true here. Okay, so this means that it will ignore this index and then it will start its own index from 0. So if we run this code now, you can see that we get 0 and 1. That's what we wanted. Now what we want with this get transactions method is we want to be able to get transactions from a specific category. For example, if we just want to get grocery transactions, for example, we should be able to get those transactions. Okay, if we want to get stationary transactions, we should only be able to get those transactions. So to do that, we need to use a conditional statement in our get transactions method, and then we're going to pass a parameter here. Okay, so this parameter will be the category. So we're going to use this category to filter our data frame for specific transactions. So for example, if we want to get transactions if we want to get stationary transactions, for example, we will be able to pass stationary as a category, and then we'll be able to retrieve only transactions that have the category stationary in them. Okay, so let's pass a parameter here. Let's just call this category. So, and we'll pass it a default value of none. So if we don't pass any value to this category parameter, then our get transactions method will return the whole table of transactions. Okay, it will return the whole data frame. So now let's add a conditional statement here that we're going to use to filter our data frame. So we'll say if category, okay, if we pass a value for category, we want our method to return. So let's access our data frame. So remember, the name of our data frame is transactions. Okay, so inside of these transactions, we are going to filter. We're going to pass a code that will filter our transactions for transactions that match the category that has been passed. So we'll say self.transactions, okay, and then we'll pass the category column here, okay. We'll access the category column. So if the value in this category column matches the value that we have passed here, okay, as the argument, just like that, we want that category to be returned. So if we've passed groceries here and there is groceries in our category column, then groceries will be returned. This is what this will do. If we don't pass any values, if we don't pass an argument to this category parameter, then we are going to return the whole table like we've done here. So now let's try to filter our data frame. Let's say we want to see transactions that are categorized as stationary. So we're going to pass stationary argument, just like that. So when we run this code, what we expect to see is stationary only. Okay, let's run this code. So you can see that we get stationary. So this get transactions method will help us get specific transactions from our tracker. So if we want to view stationary transactions or grocery transactions, we'll just pass that as an argument here. If we don't pass it, then we are going to get the whole table. Now, let's add another method here. This method will be used to get the spending. So let's call this method get total spending. And this should return the amount that we have spent. Okay, so the amount that we have spent will be in this amount column. So what we need is to return the sum of the amount column. So we're going to access this column. Okay, this is the amount column. And then we'll use the sum method to sum this column. So this will give us the total amount that we have spent. So now, if we call this get total spending method on the object, get total spending method, we should get a total of $12 since we have spent $2 here and $10 here. Okay, so if we run this code, you can see that we get 12 here, which is great. Now, we should also be able to get how much money we spend on a particular category. So for example, we should be able to see how much money we spent on groceries, how much money we spent on stationery, and so forth. So we need to add another category parameter here that we're going to use to filter our data frame. So if we pass a particular category, we should be able to get how much money we've spent in that particular category. So for example, if we want to see how much money we spent on groceries, we should be able to get the total spending on groceries. So if category, okay, if we pass a value to the category parameter, we want our method to return, okay, so we're going to access this data frame, okay, and then we'll access the category column, okay, So if this category column, if a value in this category column matches to what we've passed here, to the value that we've passed as an argument here, okay, so we'll pass category here. We want the corresponding values or the amounts, okay, so we'll pass the amount column here, okay. We want the corresponding amounts of that category to be summed. So we'll sum them here using the sum method. So now, if let's say we add another stationary transaction to our data frame, okay, let's add transactions, and let's just copy this here. So let's say on the same day we bought some pens, okay, buying pens, and let's say we spent $5. Okay, so now when we call our get spending method here and we pass it stationary, okay, this method should return how much money we spent on stationary. So we're going to pass category here as stationary, okay. So this should give us $15. We've spent $10 and $5 on stationary. So if we run this code, we get 15, okay. Total spending $15. So now we can filter our data frame for specific transactions based on the category column. If we don't filter, okay, let's pass a default value of none here. So if we don't filter, for example here, if we don't filter, we just call the method without passing an argument to the category parameter, we should get the spending for the whole amount column. If we run this code, we get 17 here, okay. So we spent $10, $5 and $2, which is a total of $17. Okay, now something else that I want to add to our tracker is the budget. So we don't have the budget here, so let's add the budget. It's important that we set a budget, and then we should be able to see if our spending is within the budget or if we have exceeded the budget. So let's add another parameter here, okay. This will be the budget. So the budget, let's say budget will be budget, okay. So when we are creating an object of this class, we need now to pass it a budget value. So let's say our budget is $20, and let's create another method here. This method should be able to allow us to view the budget. So let's call this method get budget, let's say balance, okay. And this method will return how much money we have in our budget. So let's say return budget, like that. So if we use it here, if we call the get budget method, we should be able to see $20. That's the amount of money that we have in our budget. Let's run this code. So we have $20. Now, what we also want to be able to do is we want to be able to get the balance. So the balance will be the difference between, let's create a balance variable here. So the balance will be the difference between the budget and the total spending. So the total spending is the total of the amount column of our data frame. So we'll say transactions, amount, access the amount column, and then sum the amount column. Okay, And let's say we want our method here to return the balance. So we have spent $10, $5, and $2. So we expect our balance to be $3. So that's the difference between our budget of $20 and how much we've spent. So if we run this code, you can see that we get $3 here. So now what we want is we want our get budget balance to warn us when we have exceeded our budget. So let's create a conditional statement here. Okay, so this conditional statement should be able to check the value of this balance here. If this balance is negative, meaning that we have spent more on transactions than what we have budgeted for, it should return what? Okay, so we'll say if balance, let's say balance is negative, which is less than 0, we want this method to return budget exceeded. Okay, and then it should give us the amount here. So let's use an if string, and we'll pass the balance here. So if our spending exceed our budget, this method here will return budget exceeded, and then it will give us the amount by which we have exceeded the budget. And if we haven't, we want this to return, let's use another if string here, expenses within budget, and should also return the balance like that. Okay, so let's see what happens when we run this code. So expenses within budget, we get $3. Okay, this is how much balance we have. Let's add another transaction here. Let's see what happens when we exceed our budget. So let's add another transaction here. Let's say we buy some salt for $5. Okay, now our spending has gone up. This is $10, $5, and another $5 here. So we'll spend $22. So if we run this code, we get budget exceeded, and then we get a -2 here, meaning that we have exceeded our budget by $2. Okay, so let's add some space here. Okay, so we have spent $22, and we get a warning here that budget has been exceeded by $2. Let's run this code again. There you have it. We get $2. So this is a simple tracker that we have created here. So using this tracker, we are able to add transactions. We can get transactions. We can get total spending. And then we can also get the budget balance. And then we are using the Pandas data frame to save our transactions. Okay, so this is a good project to do if you want to enhance your Python skills. And the goodness about this project is that you also get to work with Pandas. So if you are a data analyst or you want to become a data analyst, you have to work with Pandas. And this project here gives you a chance to interact with a Pandas data frame. This is what you need for your practice. Obviously, there's more stuff that we can add to this, but we are going to stop here. So give it a shot, build your own tracker, and that will give you a chance to get familiar with a lot of the stuff that we have covered in this small project here.